Welcome to the Sherman Show. I'm Jeff Sherman here with my co-host Sam Lau.
Hey, hey.
And today we have, as always, special guest, a returning guest here. I think it's his third time on the Sherman Show, Professor Robert Shiller. Welcome.
Nice to be here.
So, Professor Shiller, we're up in the ante from the podcast this time. We're actually recording this for our YouTube channel. And for our listeners out there that want to view this video, you can catch us at youtube.com/DoubleLine Capital and download the video and see what we're really looking like today and what we're discussing in video format. But Professor Shiller, thanks for coming in the office today. We really appreciate it. We're having you at events, so I appreciate you taking all the time today. But as you see on the table here, for the folks who look at the video, we have a book in front of us called Narrative Economics. Professor Shiller, what is narrative economics?
I defined it in this book. So there was an earlier discussion of narrative economics. It goes back to 1894. That used to be economics in narrative form, chronologies, history. But mine is a little different. For me, narrative economics is the study of narratives, not making narratives, study of popular narratives that circulate among the general public and that affect their economic decisions. We want to know how people's thinking changes through time. And people don't explain themselves. They don't explain what models they have. But they do talk, and we have to figure out from the stories they tell what's changing in their thinking.
Well, I mean, when you go back to the principles of your CAPE ratio, when you published that paper back in 1988 with John Campbell, I've always thought of that as a behavioral type of construct. Like, why do people pay so much for certain securities or certain segments of the market or the overall market? And further to that, why do they loathe it when it looks so cheap? The old adage is that investing is the one place that investors never look for things on sale. How does that tie into a narrative?
Well, I'll give you an example. People have to have some understanding of the economy, but you can't get them to express it. I'll give you an example from criminology.
Okay.
A researcher went into a prison thinking that he would learn about prisoners' outlook, philosophy, etc., and tried asking one of the prisoners, "Can you tell me what your philosophy of life is?" And he wasn't getting a very good response. Prisoners don't usually talk that way. But then he found out a way to really elicit it. He asked them, "See that guy over there, the other prisoner? Why is he in here?" And then these people they would tell the whole story of what crimes this other man had committed. And in the middle of it, you would find moral judgments. These people are not amoral. They have a different view of what's appropriate and right. And they are sometimes kind-hearted and all that. That's how you have to infer what people's thinking is. People talk in terms of story. Mostly, we talk about people, gossip, and especially colorful people and celebrities. But deep underneath it, there's some meaning to these stories. It's the quality of the narrative that we go after.
Well, is some of that just the way that the brain processes memories, right? It's trying to recall things within one's memory. And so is it that the narratives help us remember these stories? How do they change? I remember as a child playing the telephone game, right?
Where, yes, right.
Maybe you can explain how you think about that and how that works into narratives as well.
Right. The telephone game consists of you have a circle of students, and one of them you whisper into the ear. You are the teacher. A short story, and then you tell that student to whisper the same story to the next student, and go all the way around to the last student, and then the last student tells what the story was, and it is totally garbled by the end that it comes around. So that's this. But I think that the stories are not totally garbled. It's some essence remains. It isn't totally garbled.
Right.
And so there is something that goes viral about stories, and they will be remembered 100 years later, or even longer than that, if it's viral enough.
Right. So maybe you could talk about some of the early viral stories that you discuss in your book today.
Well, I have 9 narratives in my book, perennial narratives that they haven't gone away, but they have outbreaks, like a disease, like an epidemic.
That's where viral comes from,
That's what
right?
going viral
Right,
means, yeah. So one example is stories about machines replacing jobs.
That's very popular today, that narrative,
I
right?
know.
Yes.
It's very popular, but it's imbued with different meanings at different times. The first big explosion of that epidemic was in 1811 in the United Kingdom with a group called the Luddites.
Okay.
And their jobs were being replaced. They were weavers, hand weavers, and they were coming in with these new power looms that automatically did their job. And they got really upset, and they broke into the factory one night, and they smashed the machines. That made all the newspapers over the whole world. Everybody learned about the Luddites. But then it faded away, but there were other ones. There were the swing riots in the 1920s when some agricultural machine was replacing agricultural workers. It was big back then because people who lived their whole family history was all on the farm, and now they were fired from their job. And they could see it coming to more and more people. It seemed like the day of judgment had arrived or something like that. And we're going through another resurgence of this, but we have a different name for it, and it's informed by different examples. Now it's artificial intelligence, which has some things like driverless cars, or they now have a robot that can solve Rubik's Cube running in that's the latest that I can think of.
It's funny, it took like 30 plus years since the invention of the Rubik's Cube, maybe 40, for actually to get a robot or a machine to be able to solve it itself, right?
Yeah, that's totally useless, but it does scare people. Well,
Right.
but now I don't think people are very scared at the moment because nothing bad seems to be happening on that front. Well, we blame it on immigration or something else.
Well, I consider myself a modern-day Luddite, and I tend to shun technology to the extent that I can. But for some reason, I always focus on the stories that come down to automation, AI, and just the labor replacing aspect of the jobs. And it seems to be at the forefront of people's minds, especially, I tune into these political debates nowadays, and it just seems like that fourth industrial revolution, as they're calling it, seems to be gravitating in people's minds. And I think that was part of the discussion topics that you had when you were earlier this year at the World Economic Forum as well, right? In Davos.
I think one of the recent Davos events, the theme was named as the fourth industrial revolution. And it is scaring some people. But I think that it has the potential to come back with great force if unemployment goes up. Yeah. That's what happened in the Great Depression. And people started to think that they'd never get their jobs back because they were being replaced by a machine. And if they hadn't been replaced yet, it's coming. Mm-hmm. And then you'll be permanently out of it. So they didn't want to spend money because they were afraid.
Well, and that's the self-fulfilling side of it. But I recall this as a child, seeing kind of even movies in the early '80s of talking about this in the automotive industry, right? That there was I forget it was like a Michael Keaton movie or something too. Gung Ho, right? That's right. Where it's the fear of ultimately that the machine will take the job. But isn't it just that we have to embrace technology? We continue to evolve. And it's more of an idea of getting the right training, the right skills to utilize that and use it to one's advantage, right? And that's what we've seen with the human spirit over time, right?
In each of these cases, going back to the Luddites, people argued that there will be another job for you, and it won't be as monotonous as weaving all day long. And so, so far, that's turned out to be right.
Well, we get to sit around. These are our jobs to sit around and tell these narratives that people have been creating.
Well, maybe we'll evolve into a society that is much more relaxed and much more nurturing of children and elderly and handicapped. Yeah. We'll sit around and tell stories all the time. Maybe.
Yeah, it's always fun to sit around and tell stories, right? I mean, I think that's part of the human condition.
And that's why things move. That's why ideas are carried. They're like donkeys that carry the ideas.
Yeah. So you were talking about the garbling, and I brought it up to the telephone game. It reminds me of the story of like information theory, right? When we're talking about Bell Labs and what signal do you need to actually transmit information? What's the redundancy behind it? And what happens in these narratives as you think about it to really impacting society? right? So you just mentioned about people being fearful their job's going to go away, so they curtail spending. How much of these are self-fulfilling, and is it really that we have business and economic cycles, or is it just that we as human beings create them simply due to, let's say, our fear or our greed?
Well, part of what happens in the economy is the result of technology and progress. When they invented the railroad, we had a big project ahead of us, building all those railroads.
Yeah.
They were expensive. It was a big project. Those things drive business cycles as well. But I think that a big part of business cycles is the self-fulfilling prophecy type.
Right.
And a lot of people believe that also. That is a narrative.
Right.
So back in 1933, in the height of the Great Depression, Franklin Delano Roosevelt said, "The only thing we have to fear is fear itself." That was a story of the Great Depression that had it depending on our confidence or stories that convey confidence or lack thereof.
So let's take that example, and we're at year 10 plus of the expansion, whether or not we call it a bull market or not, but at least from the bottom of the economic expansion or the contraction we had back in 08 and early 09. And so people keep asking recession probability. I've told people if we're going to have a recession right now, it feels like it's the most well-telegraphed recession known to man,
yeah.
right? And so is some of the technology feeding this? Is it that we can prevent it because we know so much about it? Or is it just that we're doomed to repeat ourselves through these perennial type of narratives that we continue to do?
Well, doom is a rather strong word.
Okay.
Recessions usually aren't that bad.
Yeah.
But they do throw a monkey wrench in some works. And I think they are somewhat manageable. We're doing better than we used to do.
Mm-hmm.
But it's not just because of interest rate setting policy. It's also because of the understanding that people have in government about the importance of narrative. So, for example, when the Northern Rock Bank experienced a run in the UK,
07?
In 07, yeah. Then the British government bailed out the depositors.
Yep.
Ex post, they just raised the insurance limit.
Mm-hmm.
That was because they knew that if what was starting to move was a narrative that no bank is safe. And it can be a self-fulfilling prophecy. It very much is. That's not even questioned.
Especially in a reserve system, right? Yeah.
Fractional reserve system.
Yeah.
So when someone says to you, you better get right over to the Eagle Bank because they're going under, you will go there, and then you'll see a whole crowd of people trying to get into the bank,
Right.
and you'll panic. That's what they called it, panic.
Yeah.
But those things didn't really happen very prominently before the 19th century. So something developed in our thinking at that time.
So I was at an event you were speaking at a couple years ago where you'd just given this speech about narrative economics. And I believe you said, you may not use the phrase, but my recollection, and see here I go with my own narrative, was that you talking about narratives and applying to the field of economics was almost heresy, right? The idea that it's not this science, this very algorithmic thing that we can write down was kind of in the face of the belief of all the economists. And so was that a good recollection? Secondly, how do you think it's been being embraced as you've done more and more research and been talking about it further?
Well, I started this book a couple of years ago when I gave my presidential address to the American Economic Association. And I was afraid they might boo me because I was a little critical of their omission of narratives from their analysis. But they applauded. Yeah. And they've always been nice about it. I don't know what they're saying behind my back.
But at least to your face.
Some of them don't like it, I'm sure. What they don't like about it is that it looks unscientific. All these silly stories people are telling, we're not going to research that. Yeah. They think you have to keep a certain level of dignity to the profession. But the problem is, this is what's really happening, I think. Mm-hmm. And we have to face it's a little bit slippery and hard to measure narratives. It's more than a little, it's quite slippery. But I think we have improved technology in terms of digitized text and computer search that we can actually do better. And I think that the future will move ahead with narrative economics because young researchers want to do something new and different, and this is already happening. There's people looking at narratives.
Yeah, and this is just, you're talking about the ability to quantify the data. And as you mentioned, the advances in technology. It's, we can go on Google nowadays and Google Trends, Google Books / Ngrams,
right?
to search the books. I mean, versus just using, was it ProQuest before back in the day? It seems like it's
before that it
for
was
most people.
microfilmed. You have to go to the library and take out these reels of thing and put them on a film reader.
And that's the job you give to the interns because it's
right. So you're not there and you don't experience. What I love to do now is go back and read old newspapers like 100 years ago.
Yeah.
And just sort of get involved. Read every day for the same month and day. For about 100 years ago.
What do you learn from that? What is it? What
First of all,
kind of insight
the thing is they're remarkably similar to people today. Movies tend to emphasize the difference. But when you read some of them, it sounds, I feel like telling my wife, I just heard in the news this morning something you wrote, but wait a minute, that was 100 years ago this morning.
As the research progresses, I mean, how do you see this advancing in terms of your work in it and it expanding beyond that, and then ultimately what the applications would be for narrative economics?
One thing is that economics has gotten rather remiss in studying history, and they don't, or other social sciences. It's coming around, not so much economic history. That's not a big area now, but it should be. Because ultimately your intuitions about what can happen in the future are shaped by actually reading what happened. It doesn't necessarily accord with anybody's nice theory. The world is complicated, and people have strange motivations that surprise you. Right. They want to start wars. Why would anybody start a war?
Yeah, that doesn't really fit into the supposition of rationality to start with, right? Maybe it does for the war.
There is some rationality. It's actually an important idea to model the rational behavior of people as an exercise. Mm-hmm. If everyone was rational, what would the economy look like? But that's not the finished job. You have to start thinking about what it was really going on in people's mind. And it's not constant through time.
So what motivated you to really start thinking about this? Like, what made you seek this out? And were you just branching off into other fields? And you were noticing that the narratives were prevalent and accepted. How did you stumble across this, or what really got you to say we need to really discuss this in a form in a more formalized fashion?
Well, I have been at this for a long time. Starts out when I was a teenager, and I was in college at University of Michigan, and I took a history course that talked about economics. And I thought, these people have something really important, these historians, to say. So it's been on my mind ever since. When I became president of the AEA, American Economic Association, I thought, I went and read some other presidential addresses. A lot of them actually criticized the profession. I don't know what, something that comes over you when you have this title.
Yeah, you've achieved the pinnacle of there, right. And so you need to tell everybody how bad it is. Huh?
But it's really, actually, I am a big admirer of what goes on. Yeah. And actually, the profession of economics and finance are both changing. They're becoming more down to earth, I think, than they were 50 years ago or 30 years ago.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's why I said when we started off, I think of it as a behavioral aspect, and I think the narrative side has resonated with me as well, because what you're trying to do is either justify one's behavior or why that behavior isn't appropriate. And you'd mentioned talking about interest rate policy. Well, I think that when I look at Chairman Powell and his nervousness, his 8 times a year he has to get up there and give that speech after the FOMC meetings, I think a lot of it is him trying to exude confidence. That right. We have a good plan. And again, not to be critical of Mr. Powell, but the idea is to tell people it's okay. We're watching. We're trying to do the right things. Whether or not you agree with them is a lot of it, especially when you get to this high level, is trying to be a leader and convince people and coerce them that maybe things could be bad, but we'll get through it. Right?
This reminds me, Roy Hawtrey wrote a book 100 years ago called The Art of Central Banking, saying it is an art, not a science. Mm-hmm. And I think that another thing that comes from my book is that maybe it's worthwhile to study the humanities, history, literature, art, music, because they're all part of human nature, and understanding that ultimately aids in your quantitative work
Yeah.
as well.
Yeah. Well, you mentioned that, and you talked about history of economics. For your PhD students, do they have to study? Is there a course, history of economics or economic
Well,
history?
there's economic history and there's history of economic thought,
Okay.
but they're not typically required, and it's not something that is prominent.
Okay. Because I remembered as an undergraduate, I had to take the history of mathematics, and learning about that. And I think it is useful to see how things happen. But I find it curious that you say studying the humanities, because there are a lot of, I think, correlations there, or at least just strong relationships, because you talk cyclicality. I mean, music is a lot of cyclicality, right? Arts tend to be trend following, right? You have a trend, and there's a new type of style that becomes prevalent. And so, how does this evolve as we think about it? Or are we just saying that really this is really just be a student of history? Go back and learn how people have behaved.
I wouldn't go that far. Well, you can do that. That is a major, but it's not for everyone.
Sure.
But I think that we do have to try to be Renaissance men and women and learn about other fields, because you can go off on your sense of perspective about what's real and important can be off if you don't study widely.
Yeah. Well, what do you think are the most, you mentioned perennial narratives. As you went back and you've looked at the last couple hundred years, which ones do you think are the most prevalent that just keep rising time and time again?
Well, the confidence narrative, which I list first, is something that wasn't always with it. There was a confidence narratives about armies who would sometimes lose confidence and retreat and lose the battle because they lost confidence. But they didn't talk so much about the economy. A lot of this came in after 1929. Before 1929, newspapers didn't quote very often stock price indices. Now it's right on the front page and on the TV news show that's in a banner that's moving all the time.
Right.
So the stock market as some sort of a gauge of confidence. Before the early 19th century, there wasn't much talk about panics or bank runs. So there must have been bank runs in the 18th century, but not really, because people didn't talk about that. So what is a bank run? That's when someone tells you that it's about to collapse and you better get there. But you won't be, if you've never heard of a bank run, if you've never heard the story, you won't react.
Right.
So and then the 1929 story was a story that people really reacted to. But I think that before that, there were narratives already in place. Notably, the technological unemployment narrative. Mm-hmm. They didn't say artificial intelligence at all,
right,
but they thought machines were replacing jobs. And that started in the 1920s. And it led to, when the crash came in October of 1929, immediately people jumped on that story. I don't know if it was a logical consequence, but they thought this was a sign that something's coming. Something with technology that's bad for our jobs is coming. And that's another narrative that really drove the Great Depression.
Well, I think one thing I learned reading the book, and again seeing a couple of your presentations over the last couple of years, is that the idea of classifying these events. And during the Great Depression, no one called it the Great Depression, right? And that we assign these
names.
Not
no one, but almost no one.
Sorry, no one. I'm being too specific there, yeah.
You can search for them and find them.
Yeah, there were some there, yeah. And it's like irrational exuberance. It hits the lexicon and people use it. So when you think about this, why do we have this need as human beings to ascribe this, a lot of times they're alliterative, or they have some
they're cute.
Yeah, right. Why is it? Is it that we're trying to make these less painful, or is it just that the phraseology is what really resonates with us?
Yeah, this is where we bring in the humanities and the course you took in comparative literature. Why do some novels succeed and others just never get off the ground? That is difficult. There are people who try to analyze with computers so they feed in them to a computer, the texts of millions of novels, and then ask it with machine learning to figure out which ones were bestsellers. But machines have trouble doing that still, and it's partly because they don't have any human sense of what people are thinking about at that time and what resonates. What you have to take account what resonates with them in recent past and how it could be cleverly transformed into a new variant that's intriguing. I don't know what it is. No, they're closer than anybody else at the university, but I think they haven't resolved it fully either.
Yeah. No, it's really interesting because it shares the resemblance across like every field of study. And so I guess as we talk about investing, what would be your advice to people when thinking about narratives? Is it to be cautious on them? Is it to try to understand this? Is it something that's redundant from points in the past? Or is it to just, understand that as humans, we're always going to have fads and, that's just the nature of markets?
Well, I think that the answer is somewhat subtle. And to think of yourself as a business person who is on TV and the market is falling rapidly or something like that, what is your obligation? Maybe you should try to be optimistic?
I think you should, right? I mean, maybe so, but maybe you should be honest.
Well, yeah.
That's not good TV, though, typically. But, yeah.
That's the moral dilemma. Yeah,
it's the moral dilemma,
being honest may be kind of stick in the mud and boring. But then there's a moral dimension.
Right.
I don't think there are easy answers to these questions.
Yeah.
But the best thing I can say is you have to study hard, and for your own investing decision, you might want to delegate that.
Yeah.
And use advice.
Well, we notice this when you think about each, let's say, calendar year. I mean, they tend to be extremely faddish, right? I mean, this year's been the, I would kind of say it's been the year of the pseudo meat or the plant-based type of stuff, like fake meat, I think people have been calling it.
Oh, yeah.
Last year was marijuana. The year before, it was, cryptocurrencies. There tends to be this one theme that people would grab on. It's going to be life-changing.
Cool. These things. Yeah, cryptocurrency, that's really cool.
It seems cool. I still don't understand it.
So is marijuana.
Yeah, right. That's what all the kids said in high school. They were cool because they did it, right, too. But, the plant-based food seems cool, seems ecological, right? And so it's all these things that kind of feed into the psychosis of what's going on in just society, right?
No, it's not as if there aren't other people shorting these.
Oh, great. Oh, no. Yeah, right. Right. It doesn't mean you'll make money or anything, but I'm saying they just seem to really catch on. And I think that's really what I got from reading the book was that, you see that these are just time and time again. The players are slightly different. It could be the cryptocurrency because of the fear of the banks. And it's, going to be '08 over again, or it's the, as you said, the Northern Rock situation. But they all kind of resonate. They have some underlying premise. And I think that's what I really got out of reading this.
Well, I'm glad you got something out of it, and I'm hopeful that. But it's not just my book. I think this is coming.
Yeah.
Just as the data revolutions, and we have that with digitized text and search engines that are getting better and better. Data revolutions encourage intellectual revolutions.
Right, and I think what Sam was mentioning earlier, just what you can do with the search engines, right, where, just the compiling this data, the trends, and trying to catch those societal trends. Somehow in my email, someone signed me up for this thing called Word of the Day. And I was like, what is this stupid thing? And then after a while, you delete it a lot, and I was like, I'm going to click it. Yeah. And then now I'm kind of addicted to it.
It gives you an unusual definition.
Sometimes they're unusual. Some of them it's like, I should have known that. But
words that a lot that a lot of people don't
probably know the meaning.
You sort of got it wrong.
Yeah, or you look at it and it's like, well, that's not what I thought that word really was. Yeah. But what I noticed within it, which is what I was going towards, is that it also shows the trend usage. Of the word. Yeah. And it's pretty amazing to see some of these that they were very popular in the 17 or 1800s fall off, and then they come back, they have a resurgence. And so, again, I don't know where this came from. Someone signed me up for it. I get a lot of spam and things, but that's something that I found here because it's the same thing with, vocabulary, right? Words come into favor. They change meanings over time. And so I think it's very similar to what we're discussing.
They also have multiple meanings. Yeah. What a complicated mess our language is.
It really is, but that's also because we borrow from so many as well, too, right?
It's also, I mean, the transmission mechanism that you're talking about today as well. Everything that we've talked about more recently is digital. It's on the interweb, so it makes the future tracking and quantifying of these changes in the narrative, changes in the trends, that much easier to keep up with versus going back to digitized reprints, copies of books or newspapers going back to 1800s.
Well, I think you've always tried to do this, right, Professor? If I recall, you've always been very big on surveys.
Yeah,
right? Isn't survey trying to determine the pulse in the narrative? Or
I've been doing surveys for 30 years. What I used to think is that the ideal thing is to write a questionnaire and never change it. Give the whole questionnaire again and again and again over the years.
Control the sample, right?
And then because questions depend on context. And if someone takes one question from a survey and doesn't take account of what was asked just before, which reminded people of things, they'll get a different answer. So I wanted to have a clean, perfect question. But the problem with that, I discovered, is the meaning of words changes. New words come up that I didn't think of back then that I could ask about. So it's not so easy. And I think that the alternative is the other extreme where you just listen to people, but as you say, on digitized texts. But I think there are more in-depth combinations of these things that we'll eventually learn better how to understand what people are thinking in history.
Well, I got to say, every time we have a conversation, you're always thinking of something different and pushing us. And I'm always glad to see that, too, that you're not just stuck in one thing. You're always trying to contribute. And that's one thing we really appreciate you spending time with us and kind of sharing your ideas, because I know I always learn from it. And so it's great to have you here today. But before we leave, you know that Sam has a game he likes to play before we leave.
Oh, I haven't. Yeah, you played it on me, and I forgot all about it.
Yeah, so we'll have Sam remind you and our listeners the rules.
I should have prepared for this.
Yeah, there's no preparation for this. There's no context given. So this favorite part of the show is called Sherman Says. And as you don't recall, I'll go over the rules again. What I'll do is I'll provide a prompt to which you'll give a top-of-mind response.
Okay.
Just to remind you, one of the ones in the last series that we gave you was cocoa back in Zurich earlier this year, to which you had to reply about you're not sure why you're giving it to it by the folks over at Barclays all the time, but it prompted a nice little response from you. So we'll try to achieve
the narrative.
Oh,
Professor Shiller loves cocoa.
Everyone else was having coffee, and I asked for cocoa. And somehow that became my defining trait. I don't know how that happened.
That's it. So,
all right, let's go.
What we'll do is start out with Mr. Sherman with yield curve targeting.
Horrible idea.
Mr. Professor Shiller, actually, deflation.
Tragic idea.
You had to one-up me with your word of the day, tragic.
Oh, it has to be one word?
No.
I would say, remember my word of the day story we just discussed, as I was saying. Okay.
Christine Lagarde.
Good luck.
Mario Draghi.
Oh, an old friend of mine from 30 years ago. I haven't kept in touch.
Oh, you need to.
But I have to say something about
He's been busy.
No, you don't have to say anything bad about him, you know?
Going back to Mr. Sherman with protectionism.
Trending.
Modern monetary theory.
Old stuff in new garb.
It almost sounds like QE4, the recent $60 billion a month. Right. Global supply chains.
Redefining.
Universal basic income.
The first thing that creeps into my mind is inevitable, but I don't know if I want to say that. We have Thomas Paine advocated that in 1795, I think.
It's been around.
It's been around. Yeah. It's one of those universal perennial narratives that we may have to do it someday.
Yeah. Question is, some would even question if we've already been doing it, to some extent. So, final round is Russian trolls.
Perennial. At least so I'm told.
And the final one for Professor Shiller is sushi.
Sushi. I'd like some right now.
Oh, yeah?
Well, LA, we have a fair amount of sushi. There's some great restaurants.
Yeah,
So
all
hopefully
right.
we can try to score you some of that in between this and the next event. So again, Professor Shiller, many thanks for joining us today, taking the time out of your busy schedule. Congratulations on the publishing of your latest book out there. It's Narrative Economics. You can buy that on Amazon, right? Or if you can find a retailer that still has a brick and mortar store in your local city, please pick it up there as well. You can follow us on at Sherman Show Pod on the Twitter. We have the YouTube account, as we mentioned, youtube.com/DoubleLine Capital. And as always, you can catch us on SoundCloud, iTunes, Google Play, Stitcher now, Spotify, some other things I've never heard of. Our listeners keep saying these are the places to go. So there's more and more distribution out there for the podcast.
That's contagion.
It is contagion. So again, thanks again for listening. Tune in a couple weeks as we'll have a new episode out for you then. Again, thanks again, Professor.
My pleasure.